of communication, the Communification Podcast.
Hi there, everyone. I just wanted to drop in a little intro because this particular episode, unfortunately, the platform that I use, Riverside, has been giving me lots of problems lately. And for this episode, the tracks kind of overlap with my video. And it skips, and there are things that are out of order. So I did my very best to edit things so that they were at least in order. You'll see one section I kind of left where we had the overlap. I did my best to cut out some sections and to make it flow as best as I could. If you want to hear the full interview in its entirety, I would suggest going to the audio version. But if you like to watch video, this one will do as well.
Aloha, Dr. Hall. Thank you for joining me on the Communification Podcast.
It's so much fun to be here.
Well, I really enjoyed reading some of the literature that you've put out. This topic is so interesting to me. So to start, how about you tell us what drew you to the study of human communication? Why are you interested in this field? Where does that passion come from?
Yeah, definitely. I remember when I was an undergraduate, I was undecided for almost 2 years. And in that time, I was so interested in people. Like, I thought people were the most fascinating thing in the world. I was trying to understand what motivated them. I loved having these long kind of undergraduate conversations, figuring out what mattered to me. And I find myself kind of amazed that 20 years later, here I am answering very similar questions to the one that I asked myself back 20 years ago.
So amazing. So what are the topics that you study?
So I would say I've really kind of made two kind of areas of interest really my home. One of them is I studied a lot early on about flirting, about attraction, about online presentations of self, like through online dating, and all of those things that really sort of are about the process of initiating relationships. Right now, I'm really focused on kind of technology and all of the ways it influences our relationships. So around friendship, around family, about the ways it, basically everything from phone calls and video chat to texting and all of that is part of the way that we maintain and develop our relationships.
Oh my gosh, fascinating. I mean, you're preaching to the choir here because I find all of this so fascinating. But on that topic then, to kick it off, why don't we start with some simple definitions?
Okay.
So we kind of skirted around this in episode 1. So if we could get a clearer definition of what impression management is and what self-presentation is.
Absolutely. So what's interesting here is when we think about these two kind of parts, one has to do with this sort of part in which that we're acknowledging or thinking about how other people see us. So anytime that you're very concerned with this issue of how am I modifying the way that I self-present in order to kind of achieve some sort of goal, then you're engaging in impression management. So self-presentation is kind of the tool by which we manage other people's impressions of ourselves. What's interesting is we can also think of kind of self-presentation and impression management on sort of like a continua. So right now, meeting you as a new time, the first time I've ever done this, I'm actually doing a lot of self kind of presenting. Like I'm working very hard to monitor myself, my impression management. But if I'm home with my family who have seen me for their entire lives or for 20 years with my wife, I don't do a lot of impression management because who I am is very much relaxed. I don't really think about how they see me so much. So we can think about the idea that relationships and impression management really sort of play a huge role in how much work we have to do into our self-presentation.
Well, and side note to all the listeners, full disclosure here, I got the time wrong with Jeff. And so I'm on an hour earlier than I thought, so I didn't do my makeup. And I said that to you twice. You know, it was the self-presentation. Like, oh, I'm so sorry. I would have put a little bit of mascara on for you to be a little more. I would have not worn a sweater so that you would think that I'm more professional because I want to manage that impression because you are, you know, a researcher and an academic.
But in part, actually, what it also is able to do, though, is acknowledging that we're working hard to make an impression also tells another person a message, right? So when we, both in the process of saying that I care about the way that I come across, but also being self-conscious about it often means that we're going to have something that's more informal, right? You and I are going to have a conversation. We're going to treat each other in a more friendly way rather than a professional way. So I'm on board. I'm just wearing a Henley. I'm not doing anything special.
Same. Thank you. I'm glad. Yeah, we're on the same wavelength there. Great. Okay, let's go back to the topic at hand. Let's add on another layer to that impression management, self-presentation. What is uncertainty reduction theory, and how does that factor in to a discussion about online dating specifically?
Yeah. So uncertainty reduction theory is maybe one of the oldest homegrown theories in communication. So communication has a lot of different theories in communication, but not very many are developed by people in communication about communication concepts. Uncertainty reduction theory starts with the presumption that when we meet new people, that we have a lot of uncertainty about our relationship to them. And that one of the fundamental assumptions of the theory is that we're trying to reduce. However, what's really important about that is whether or not we are actually interested in forming a relationship with that person over time. We meet maybe, dozens, scores, hundreds of strangers in a week. We don't really care that much about reducing uncertainty about them, aside from kind of assessing them in the moment. Like, is this somebody who I know you have to pay attention to? But aside from that kind of baseline level of uncertainty reduction, we don't really go into much depth. That we think we might want to get to know them, somebody that's interesting in conversation with or relationship development with, our desire to reduce uncertainty goes really high. As a consequence, online dating is very curious because people have to state all of the things that would come out in the course of conversation. They got to list things in their profile, some of what kind of partner you're seeking, but your personality and your background and your education and your interests and all these things. And all of that can be thought of as a process of not only impression management, right? You're presenting yourself in a certain sort of way, uncertainty about you. So these two things go together, but I would point out it's not the case that what you present is necessarily what's true. So as a consequence, you're kind of engaging in what we would call strategic self-presentation.
Strategic self-presentation. And I read an article that you wrote where you talk about strategic misrepresentation. So that leads us right into my next question, which is, what are some of the problems that people encounter when it comes to online dating, especially communication-wise?
Yeah, there are a lot of problems that come. Is that it's also that I have to keep in mind about online dating is that it's also transformed dating in a way we never would have guessed, 20 years ago. Recent surveys have suggested that as much as a third of Americans who got married in the last 10 years met online. That number goes up to 60%. So online dating may have problems. A couple things that I might add suggest that people are actually very careful about developing an online profile that I've heard one researcher call a promise. I'm promising you that I am this kind of person. So what you do is that you take the characteristics of yourself that you think are attractive and interesting and valuable. You might modify them slightly to seem a little more exciting, a little more energetic, but you only do so within kind of like an understanding of, I'm promising you I am going to be who the person that I really am. As a consequence, online dating has a kind of almost like a counterforce that although there's misrepresentation, people, if they want to meet face-to-face, know that it's a deal breaker if someone has misrepresented themselves entirely. And people are very concerned with that. So one thing to keep in mind about this is, although it is the case that people misrepresent online, and that's true, the data generally suggests that they do so within a certain parameters that we wouldn't be all that surprised to see in a face-to-face relationship. So let's say that you and I were meeting in a first time in a date that were set up by a friend, right? We may have engaged in some sort of, uncertainty reduction by asking your mutual friend, what does Malika really like? Like, what can I expect here? And you might ask about me as well. And then we might modify our self-presentation on that date in order to be suitable to the things that I've heard that you like, and maybe to the things that you think that I might like. What seems to happen, which is a bigger problem, is actually the idealization process. There's been some wonderful work done by like Art Ramirez and by folks who have looked at this, also Aaron Sumner, who have looked at the idea of that latency period between when you first kind of connect with a person on whatever profile you're looking at, and then when you actually see them face to face. And what's interesting about that is that there's some research that says the longer that you engage in this kind of latent process of just online communication, the more the idealization takes over. We really are relying on their very strategic self-presentation as our evidence of who they really are. So as a consequence, there's something that happens that I think is it's kind of a beautiful thing about human nature, that we want to believe great things about another person. But in terms of online dating, it usually leads to
disappointment.
Wow, that is so interesting. Oh, there was also something that listeners mentioned when I asked them to weigh in on this. And what I kept hearing over and over again from both men and women, so Michael said this, I think Lori said
Oh, yeah.
this, they keep running into the problem
Yep.
of also getting no response. So they're trying to communicate, but in order to communicate, you need things to go both ways.
Yeah,
So,
it is
but I
true.
guess I suppose a
mean, there are
non-response is
rates that
also
might
a
astonish some of your
response. It's
listeners
communicating
that I've
something.
heard that in some locations that the response rates are for, particularly for men trying to reach out to women they're interested in, a 200 to 1 attempt to response ratio. So it's really hurtful for so many kind of rejection. And of course, in this case, I'm presuming a heterosexual relationship. But I think that from women's perspective, oftentimes they are barraged by so many different messages that show interest that they're really don't have the time. They don't want to even necessarily engage in kind of polite no thank yous because the consequences of that might lead that person to continue on to pursue them because even a no thank you is a response. So what's very fascinating about this and also kind of sad about it at some level is that I think that there's not a whole lot of things that people can do in order to kind of combat that problem of gender difference in that ratio. As long as there are a lot more men who are willing to pursue a lot of different partners and our cultural script is that men should do the pursuing, I think that the most promising change on that has been what Bumble has done. But prior to that, there really weren't a whole lot of scripts or websites that, or dating sites specifically, that promoted the idea that we should flip the script and have women do the pursuing. Otherwise, we're going to have these really outlandish ratios of rejection. They talk about it being a lot of sort of effort. And I do think that one thing that I hope that all listeners, whatever, who you're interested in or whoever you are, that a general kind of a sense of trying to be a polite in your ways of both saying no and not being interested can go a long way in at least building an environment where we don't feel rejected and hurt.
Saying no in a polite way. Okay, now I'm going to go off on a tangent though, because I feel like that's attractive. Stay.
People who were most likely to handle gracefully breaking up with someone who was also someone who tended to be pretty good at relationships anyway. So what's kind of funny about that is that there's an irony there that someone who's actually really excellent at being a responsive and caring partner is also someone who you're actually going to have a good breakup with, which it makes me go, well, why would you ever break up? Like, how does that ever come to pass?
Right. Oh my gosh, so funny. Okay, so now let's
Absolutely.
switch.
Then I would say the number one
What are some of
that
the
I mentioned a little bit
benefits
earlier
of
is the
online
way that
dating
we've
when it
been
comes
able
to
to,
communication?
really create an environment for people who are marginalized or cannot find partners that are suitable in their local communities. And, there's the communications, the technology part of that, which has made it very far away from a lot of different people. In Kansas, and we have opportunities to meet people of their similar sexuality, but also learn more about their own sexuality through online dating. And I think that of all of the accomplishments of online dating, that's the one that I find the most encouraging because it really points to a way that there was a pretty dire need prior to online dating of people who are online dating has done an amazing service to our community writ large to be able to create those connections. I would say on another sort of level, I think that what it's also done in a very positive way is that it's given kind of a chance for people to be able to move away from environments which might be more dangerous or hostile, particularly to women. And I'm thinking of kind of the hookup culture. I'm thinking of bar culture. I'm thinking of the script that involves women consuming alcohol or otherwise in order to be flirted with or even, hit on or however you want to phrase it. I think that all of those practices were ones which I don't think there's any question they expose women to unnecessary risk. I think that online dating is a much more safe environment for those things. Now, that's not to say that things like catfishing or unwanted sexual pursuit or other things don't happen. It's just that online dating creates a forum in which that there's a lot of barriers of safety that I think that women in the 90s or 80s just weren't able to enjoy. So I think there's a lot of kind of positive parts about that. But, I would say the one that I think about as a researcher that I think is also kind of interesting is that it helps you figure out people who are interesting. It was actually hard to know who was available. Like, I would talk to women who I was interested in at that time of my life and then find out 6 conversations in that they were dating somebody. I'm like, oh man,
I just
like
wasted so much
I thought
time.
yeah, and I was, for sometimes you'd still be able to be friends with somebody, but it's still a disappointment.
Right.
So I think that there's an advantage to being able to know that the place that you're at has a like-minded community of people who are at least open to the possibility of dating, and that's an advantage in itself.
And maybe having deeper conversations?
What's fascinating is that a friend of mine who does research on this, and her name is Sarah Conrad, has work on empathy and also on online dating. And one of the things that she found was during the pandemic, people were more likely to have long, deep conversations in online dating because that the risk of face-to-face meeting was so high, right? I mean, pre-vaccine, meeting up with somebody that you were interested in through an online dating site was a huge risk. And so as a consequence, people were very, very careful but before making that first move. As a consequence, what she said is that the research that she did with OkCupid found that people were taking a lot more time having more in-depth conversation. Kate, and I thought that was really innovative and inspiring. It was really
That is
innovative and
super
inspiring.
inspiring. Wow. Oh, we could go on, but I'm going to switch to another topic just
That's
because,
okay.
we want to keep things going here. I have a listener soundbite. Okay, and so this one comes from Mahina. She's on the island of Oahu, and Hawaii is where a lot of my audience resides. So when I brought up the topic on Facebook, or should I call it Meta now? I mean, anyway, no, not yet. We're not going to fall. We're not going to cave to that. All right. So anyway, I brought it up. And my Hawaii people had a lot to say about the pool being really small, about
Yeah.
knowing too many people that are on there. One woman shared that she felt like men in Hawaii culturally just like didn't write adequate profiles, or they tended to be less educated. So going on a little bit of a tangent here, but this listener question kind of taps into that. So let's listen in.
Hi, Malika and Dr. Hall. Thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm wondering, do you think there are cultural or location-specific differences in ways people present themselves online when it comes to dating?
That's a
Thanks.
great question. So I was thinking about this a little bit, and there's a couple factors that I think are fascinating to others, who's particularly related to geographic lack of access. There's a lot of really interesting research that says that really transforms the way people go about dating. Um, Kind of a geographic access to others compared to really big town, or there's less cities and otherwise. The research on that actually has some things that are kind of promising for your listener, which is that people tend to not be so focused on things like physical attractiveness or looking for somebody who is like really wealthy or really more kind of desirable, because there are so fewer people to pick from. And as your reader or as your comments pointed out, there's a risk that you actually might meet this person in face to face, and you don't want to have been rude or mean or otherwise to them. So one big factor is whether or not there's a lot of other people around does change the way in which that we prioritize different characteristics. Another factor that I think might be pertinent here that I find also really interesting is there's a lot to have to do with actually gender ratios. So presuming that there is a heterosexual relationship that is being sought, when the ratio of men to women who are available changes, you see the kind of behaviors that people engage in very communities in which that there are a lot of eligible women and not a lot of eligible men. So your reader's comment could be presumed to suggest that there just aren't enough available men. It changes how willing women are to be more direct, more kind of take the more active role, the more aggressive role in courtship. And that completely switches in environments where there are very few women, but a lot of men. And those can want in order to develop the relationship, be the pursuer and engage in what we might see as traditionally masculine behaviors to be competitive, to show that they're more attractive to the few women who are available. What's curious about this plays out in a very culturally specific way. In communities that don't have a lot of eligible partners of the same race or of the same sexuality, we see very different sort of mating behaviors engaged in online and then also offline because of those different sort of forces playing out in terms of availability, in terms of selection, in terms of whether or not people actually have enough of a pool of partners to even pick from.
It's so interesting. I'm just taking this all in. It's a lot of information. And I don't even date online.
Sorry.
I'm married. But so interesting. Oh my goodness. I can't wait for the episode where we break all of this down with my girlfriend. Okay. Well, let's wrap up
Absolutely.
online dating so we can move on to that other topic. What are some research-based communication tools that listeners can use to communicate better when it comes to online dating?
Absolutely. Let me give you a handful of ones that I think are really helpful. One is don't spend too much time after you meet somebody online that you think is promising waiting to meet them offline. Don't take too much time online. Second, take your time when evaluating profiles. It is not in your interest to browse them like a menu at like whatever you can think of as a restaurant that has like 15,000 pages of a menu. You don't want it, right? I'm thinking like the Spaghetti Factory or Cheesecake Factory. That's the one with the crazy long menu. Don't do that. And the reason is that when we list, we've totally ignored the more important factors in really connecting with someone. Similarity of values, an interesting personality, something that we really think might be potential for long-term success. Instead, we focus on their attractiveness compared to everyone else in all the different, different profiles. So take your time, slow down, don't just treat people like a list of menu items. The third that I would suggest is, although there are many courtship-related books and otherwise that would recommend people to be coy, for people to withhold information and kind of titillate or tease it out, there's very little evidence that these are successful strategies in the long term. They may make your partner more pursuant, maybe, but oftentimes it just makes people feel like they're not being, listened to or heard. It makes people feel as if you're not or you're not interested in engaging in conversation because you just want to get to know them. So people don't get the clue that you want them to pursue them by being withholding. They get the clue that you want them to pursue them by being responsive to questions. So don't take too much time online. Don't run through a million different. Take the time with individual people. Be honest and open as possible, particularly in the part when you're communicating with your partner before you meet them face. May not be able to meet their expectations.
I love that. And what are some tips that you can give us for online daters to avoid the problematic side of dating?
Yeah. I think that there's a couple kind of parts that you can. One thing, unfortunately, is to know kind of what you're up against and to know that when you engage in this, especially if you're first time or just beginning to the process of it, it is work. I wish that I could say that it is going to be an enjoyable process or one that's going to environment knowing what they're getting into. And I think that that's more so for heterosexual men seeking women. They're more likely to feel a sense of rejection. I think they need to be aware of it. To avoid that, unfortunately, I'm not certain there's a clear way to avoid it, but to also accept that that's just how probably it's going to play out. The second one that I would say in terms of avoiding things that are potentially problematic is to really consider the idea that, being able to build an environment in which that we're polite and kind to one another has positive effects beyond just to that other person. When we respond in ways which are open and kind to one another, we actually tend to have a greater sense of self-esteem and self-view to be kind to the people that you're interacting with. So in some ways I'm saying yes, because kindness tends to actually have a good impact on you.
I love that. And I guess for the, strategic misrepresentations or maybe people that go even farther on that side, fact checking and asking third parties or things like that might be useful.
Yeah. The Google search. Do it.
Awesome. Such a wealth of information, just wonderful. Well, I'll be putting links to Dr. Hall's research in the show notes so you can check that out. Thank you so much for dropping so much knowledge on us.
Beautification of communication, the community